Good day, fish tankers. I recently celebrated my 50th birthday and some of my friends gave me the coolest gifts, fish keeping wise. Thank you to Sean and Angelique who gave me this very cool t-shirt. It's my very first fish related t-shirt. And then for Stefan and Nina who gave me a vintage aquarium book. It's an old book, Aquarium Fishes by Dick Moles, and it was published in 1981. I have several old aquarium books and I always like looking through them to page down memory lane and see what the hobby used to be, what it is now, and if anything have changed and how it has changed. If you want to take a trip down memory lane with me, then stick around. Okay, fish tankers, if we go through this book, then we see a lot of things. There's a lot of nostalgia if you started keeping fish in the 80s like I did. And a lot of things have changed and a lot of things have stayed the same. Now, when I go through this book, I can see several things. Now, our knowledge of fish, the fish itself and their habits, the kind of level that you need to have as a fish keeper, not necessarily as a biologist or ichthyologist, is still more or less what we had then. You know, there's lots of paragraphs here about fish anatomy, behavior, different breeding habits. That hasn't changed much. Now, if we go and we look in this book, there's also some interesting information of fish keepers of centuries ago. You know, those very narrow aquariums that you have on the wall in portrait form. I'm not a fan of them, but it can work with tiny nanofish or shrimp. That's nothing new. It was already there in 19th century France, and people kept fish in Asia in ancient times in ponds, and then in Victorian times there were elaborate indoor aquaria and public aquariums, and there's even a diagram here of a gravity-fed water pump or waterfall type feature. That will be interesting for us here in South Africa with load shedding. Maybe we must keep that diagram. If you look at fish keeping in the Victorian era, you see that was a preserve of mainly the rich people, unless with the exception of those who farmed it in ponds. And I sure had a lot of cheap labor back then that we don't necessarily have today. Now, if we go further, if we look at the actual aquariums, now in my day when I started fish keeping, along with the publication of this book, there was always tanks that the steel frames were already not really around anymore. It was just glass glued together and sealed by silicone. Pretty much today. What's different today, I would say, are all these low iron rimless tanks. They were rimless in those days up until a point and then they had bracing. Pretty much the same as the float class tanks today. These rounded edges weren't around back then. So that's as far as the aquariums go. The new thing, I think, is that low iron, very bright glass in your upper end market of aquariums. And if we go and look at the equipment, the technology, that's always interesting. As far as fish goes, basically we have more kinds of fish that we're keeping these days. And interestingly, a lot of the old style aquarium fish that are actually quite nice to keep have sort of fallen out of vogue. That is also a thing that I've noticed. Now, if we look at back to the equipment, I digress. The heating is still pretty much the same. Earlier there was asbestos plates and a paraffin heater underneath it. That was very, very old school. That was even before an ancient guy like my time. But you know, then we had pretty much the same. We had electrical heaters and they were switched on and off by thermostats. And the materials have just changed. They're more high-tech now. They are, I think, a little more reliable. But you also had the option of a separate heater and a separate thermostat that was sitting in the tank, or sometimes had your thermostat clamped against the outside glass of a tank. Nowadays you can also have a thermostat outside. You know, these little nano heaters that I like have a thermostat in the plug with a probe in the heating element. So that's pretty much the same. But what has changed as far as heating is concerned is now we have chillers as well, especially for you guys who keep marine fish. And we also have temperature controllers where you can hook chillers and heaters up, and that's sort of a backup for that thermostat that gets stuck. Well, if we go on towards filtration, not too much has changed. It was more air-driven filtration then, but now we have a sponge filter here bubbling away as a backup. And then it was all box filters, and you even had air-driven hang-on back filters, which is very much like a breeding box today, that you have to keep fry air in circulation, or even eggs. So that was all around then. But then we had also, at that time in the 80s, we had the water pumps, we had power filters, and it's still pretty much the same as today. We had canister filters as well, and you'll see those canisters, the same principle. But I think what has changed is, or are the materials used on these filters. The design is just a bit better, just a bit easier. But the big thing back then that we have now is there wasn't much knowledge about biological filtration. The emphasis was all on mechanical filtration through filter floss, some sponges, and of course activated carbon, or charcoal, as we just called it in the day. So the whole emphasis, if I read page through this book, was about getting the dirt and the pollutants out of the water. And then there's a short chapter about undergravel filters, and it's just mentioned that they work on biological principles, you know, and that's quite interesting. The water characteristics is explained much in the same way as today, with pH and hardness and what it is, and oxygen and all of that, and carbon dioxide. But in those days, there wasn't really talk about ammonia, nitrate, the nitrogen cycle. So there's basically two things. They have the undergravel filters, and they mention that they work on biological principles, and that's it. And in those days, there's a big debate on it, that some said it's just like sweeping dirt under the carpet that we have in. And undergravel filters, in fact, eventually everybody caught on, and that was what we were using. If you didn't have canister filters or anything like that, that was like the air-driven filter to have. And you could also get little power heads back then for it, as well as you do now, but the undergravel filter fell out of vogue. But I remember it very well because I used it, and it was an absolute game changer, because I didn't throw away the filter media. Now, they do say there, to prevent the dirt getting under the plate and to prevent your plants from not growing, you've got to have at least 5 centimeters, that's 2 inches of substrate of gravel on top of that plate. And that is the thing that I found when I was running a shop. If the layer is too thin, that's when you get the dirt under the plate, which isn't the end of the world anyway. But undergravel filters have gotten difficult because, you know, putting aquaswell on it's not really the ideal thing. The planted tank thing is not always the ideal thing. There's other ways to do it. But that's very interesting to me, paging through this old book, that whole understanding of the biological processes weren't there among the fish keepers themselves. But you see there, if you look in the book, they give you a table of maintenance. What do you do for seawater? What do you do for freshwater? In the seawater thing, they say there's 2 ways. Either keep it sterile, just keep changing the water and remove all the dirt from the water, or just put in as much life as you can, lots of algae, lots of sponges. They didn't talk about living rock then, but I think that was put in anyway as a result of putting in all these things and heavy aeration. And if it works for you, stick with it. That was the thing. But there's a table there, and they do advocate partial water changes. If the fish aren't right, partial water changes. So that is actually what they did to combat ammonia and nitrite spikes and so on, because once you understood the nitrogen cycle, it was a game changer, and it wasn't really emphasized at all in these books in the 80s. And I think another thing that really changed is that nowadays information is so much more dynamic and current. You just click on your smartphone and go onto the internet, you've got all the information. These books, these old school books, are still in the public library. Dick Mills, his name is familiar to me. He wrote a lot of many books in the day, and Dr. Axelrod as well, the fish breeding books. So a lot have stayed the same. If we look at the air-driven filters, they didn't stop working. The undergravel filter doesn't no longer work. And does a sponge filter really work any better than a box filter? No, not really. It's just for vogue. You can put biomedia in a box filter as well. Technology has definitely improved. And one area where I see a big improvement in the technology, that's with aquarium lights, because back in those days, we even had normal light bulbs, you know, these incandescent tungsten bulbs that generated heat. And if you wanted full spectrum, you have a lid with both a fluorescent bulb and these old school light bulbs that becomes very hot. And that was full spectrum lighting in the day. So lighting has certainly gone from strength to strength in the aquarium trade, and now we have LEDs that are mostly more economical. If I not, they give you way better light and full spectrum. So I think in the technology side, where we really had a game changer was in terms of lighting. And then, of course, in those days it was sand or gravel, and there weren't really aquaswell around. Aquaswell came much later, and the forerunner of that was sort of a lower level. When planted tanks became the vogue, I think Denelay was a company that took it on. You had a layer of sort of laterite or aquarium swell, but it was always capped off, like I do my tanks, with sand substrate to keep it below. It was like an instant made packet of dirt for a dirted tank. That's where it started. And then they also even had heating cables back in those days. And so I think with substrates for Amazonia, the Denelay, all the scaper swell, and the emphasis with aquascaping came back later. That's also a change in the hobby. But if you see here, there's fish itself, still pretty much the same thing. There's an interesting table here of fish ages, and I looked through that. I think it's more or less accurate, what I can see there. Tell me in the comment section if you think that table is accurate, and what do you think about the maintenance ideas, and also tell me, how did you start fish keeping and what do you think have changed over the years. So if you got a fish keeping friend, buy them a cool t-shirt, or go to those second-hand bookshops and get them a real old school aquarium book. And if you like this content, please remember to smash that like button. And I'm going to enjoy this book, and that's it from me, guys. Please remember to subscribe, and until I see you again, keep on taking good care of those domestic denizens of the deep.